tension and mystery, blending soft haunting tones with rising intensity to reflect the struggle of hearing
Have you ever wished you could hear what people were really thinking? What if one day that wish came true, but at a price? It happened to someone just like you. A simple accident, a sudden fall. And suddenly, the world around them became a whole lot louder. Thoughts, unspoken, raw, and real, began to flood their mind. At first, it was nothing more than a distant hum, a few stray thoughts here and there. But soon, whispers turned into clear voices, thoughts that weren't their own, thoughts they couldn't ignore. A cacophony of private moments, unfiltered truths, and a life that would never be the same again. Could you live with the constant noise, the unspoken words of everyone around you, from strangers on the street to your closest friends? Would you be able to remain grounded, knowing the deepest secrets, the darkest fears of the people closest to you? This is the story of a head injury that changed everything. A story about power, loss, and the unbearable weight of knowing more than you ever wanted to. This is the story of how one person learned to hear the thoughts of others and what they did with it. Imagine waking up one day with a strange, unsettling ability, the power to hear people's thoughts. It all started with a freak accident, a head injury that seemed like any other. But for this person, everything changed. What was once a normal life now felt like an open book for everyone around them. The simple act of walking into a room became overwhelming as the thoughts of strangers, friends, and even family members flooded their mind. At first, it seemed like a gift, an intriguing new way to understand the world and those around them. But the reality was far more complicated. With every passing day, the burden of hearing everyone's innermost thoughts grew heavier. What seemed like a blessing began to feel more like a curse. How do you live when you can't escape the noise inside people's heads? Relationships became strained, privacy no longer existed, and the world felt like an endless barrage of mental chaos. This is the story of one person's journey from ordinary life to an extraordinary and often overwhelming existence, and the profound impact it had on their mind, body, and soul. What would you do if you could hear every thought? Would it make you feel connected, or would it drive you to madness? It was an ordinary day, nothing out of the ordinary, but in the blink of an eye, everything changed. They were walking down the street just like any other day. The sun was shining, people were bustling around, and the world seemed to be moving at its usual pace. But then, without warning, the accident happened. A misstep, a slip on the wet pavement, and suddenly, the ground came rushing up. The pain was immediate, a sharp jolt to the head, a brief moment of confusion, and then darkness. When they opened their eyes, everything seemed off. At first, there was nothing unusual about it. The world looked the same. But then, as they tried to sit up, a strange sensation hit. A whisper, a thought that wasn't their own. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A passing thought from a stranger walking by. They tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a side effect of the injury. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder. The first clear thought they heard: "I wonder if I'll make it to the bus in time." It was so vivid, so real, and it wasn't their own. Panic set in. Was it a hallucination? A symptom of the concussion? They didn't know, but one thing was clear: something was different now, something they couldn't explain. At first, the voice in their head felt like a fluke, a weird side effect of the fall. But then it happened again, and again. Each time, a different voice, a different thought. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was like they could hear snippets of conversations from across the room, thoughts bubbling to the surface, uninvited, unfiltered. Walking down the street, they heard the inner musings of everyone around them. The cashier's thoughts as she bagged groceries: "I hope my shift ends soon. I'm exhausted. A teenager on the bus. I need to find a way to talk to Rachel before she finds out I lied. A mother in the park. I wonder if I'm doing this right. Am I a good mom? It was overwhelming. It was like stepping into a room where everyone's voice was at a decibel level too loud to ignore. For the first time in their life, they couldn't shut out the noise. There was a sense of amazement, sure. The curiosity was there too. What else could they hear? It felt like a strange kind of power, an ability to understand people on a deeper level, to know their thoughts before they even spoke. But it came with an undercurrent of dread. The deeper they listened, the more they understood just how intimate and vulnerable these thoughts were. Thoughts they were never meant to hear. The casual thoughts were one thing, but then they started hearing things they weren't prepared for. The raw fears, the hidden regrets, the unspoken secrets. It was no longer just an ability. It was a constant flood of information, thoughts, emotions, all tangled together. It was no longer a gift, it was a storm, and it was impossible to escape. As days turned into weeks, the initial awe of hearing people's thoughts faded, replaced by a heavy weight. What seemed like a rare gift had quickly become an unbearable burden. At first, they tried to control it, to shut out the voices, but the more they tried, the harder it became. The thoughts of others became inescapable, seeping into every moment of their life. It wasn't just hearing one person's musings, it was the constant chatter of 1,000 minds, all clamoring for attention. The first time it became too much was during dinner with their family, a simple, quiet evening. But with every bite, the voices became louder. Their father, smiling across the table, wasn't thinking about the meal. They were consumed by a deep, gnawing anxiety. What if I've failed as a parent? What if I've made mistakes that can never be fixed? The mother, gently laughing at a joke, was lost in a thought that wasn't funny at all. I wish I could leave this life. I'm too tired to keep pretending everything's okay. The thoughts weren't just disturbing, they were invasive. Each one felt like a violation, a peek into a mind that wasn't theirs. But it didn't stop with family. Everywhere they went, the same flood of thoughts followed. From the stranger on the street to their best friend sitting beside them, no one's mind was private, and the thoughts weren't always kind. There was guilt, fear, loneliness, the hidden pain of every person they encountered. As the days wore on, the emotional strain grew. The noise never stopped. Even when they were alone, they could still hear it. Their mind was constantly occupied, constantly analyzing, constantly processing. The voices of others had become like a constant hum, an overwhelming presence that blurred the lines between their thoughts and those of the world around them. The isolation grew, too. How could they share this with anyone? Who would believe them? And even if they did, how could they explain what it felt like to hear everything, to know things about people they didn't want to know? How could they ever have a normal conversation again, knowing every secret, every fear, every unspoken truth? The power to hear thoughts had stolen their peace. It had taken away their privacy and their sense of self. They began to wonder, was this a gift, or had they become cursed? The breaking point came unexpectedly during a quiet moment that seemed almost too peaceful to hold any danger. It was late at night. They were alone in their room, sitting in the silence that had once been a refuge. But now even silence wasn't an escape. The thoughts of others echoed relentlessly in their mind, a constant barrage they couldn't shut out. The weight of it all, the constant noise, the constant understanding of everyone's deepest fears and secrets had become too much. It felt like drowning in a sea of emotions they didn't want to know. The thoughts were no longer just passive whispers. They were a tidal wave, crashing over them. For the first time since the accident, they broke down. Tears blurred their vision, frustration boiled over, and the voices grew louder, more invasive, more desperate. In that moment, they couldn't tell where their thoughts ended and everyone else's began. They were overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of it all. They collapsed onto the floor, clutching their head as if they could physically block the noise. The flood of thoughts felt endless, unforgiving. They thought of the people they loved, how they could no longer look at them the same way, knowing their secrets, their hidden pain. Every conversation felt fake, every smile felt forced. They could no longer see the world through the lens of normality. They had become a prisoner to the minds of others. And then, in that moment of despair, something inside them shifted. They realized that they couldn't keep going like this. They had to make a choice. Would they let this power control them forever? Or could they learn to control it? It was no longer about trying to escape it. It was about finding a way to live with it. A sudden calmness washed over them. They stood up, taking a deep breath, and looked at the reflection in the mirror. For the first time in weeks, they saw themselves again, not as a victim of this strange ability, but as someone who could reclaim their life. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but they knew now that they had the strength to face it. The days that followed weren't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the flood of thoughts would overwhelm them once more. But they had made a choice to live with this ability, not as a prisoner, but as someone who had learned to manage it. They started taking small steps, focusing on their breath, learning to silence the noise when it became too much. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. With time, they began to set boundaries, to reclaim the spaces in their life that had been overtaken by the minds of others. They discovered that hearing thoughts wasn't always a curse. There were moments of clarity, moments when they could use this ability for good. They began to listen with purpose, offering support to those in need without them ever saying a word. It was a delicate balance, understanding when to listen and when to turn away. But with time, they found their rhythm. The once overwhelming power had become a part of them, no longer something to fear. They had learned that the greatest strength wasn't in controlling the minds of others, but in learning to control their own response to the noise. And as they stood, looking out at the world, they understood one thing for certain. Sometimes the greatest gift is not in knowing everything, but in learning how to navigate the chaos of life with grace.
Very emotional soundtrack builds tension and mystery, blending soft haunting tones with rising intensity to reflect the struggle of hearing others' thoughts after a life-changing head injury.